All right, welcome to Teach, Move, Inspire, episode number 6, if I'm not wrong. And today I am happy to sit down with a good friend of mine. It's Chris Skidmore. Chris, how you doing, man?
Good, James. Good.
It's good for you to be here again.
Yeah.
We were just speaking that I actually interviewed Chris for a project that wasn't a podcast project, but a long time ago, and that was about 3 years ago. And it feels like there's been a lot that's happened in a very small period of time.
Yeah, quite a lot.
And one thing I like about this is, so far the people I've been interviewing, the project is interviewing people of the physical and the energetic bodies. And so far the people that I've interviewed have been more on the physical. They all had the element of the energetic, but you are definitely more on the energetic than on the physical.
Yeah, for sure.
And for those of you that don't know Chris or haven't met him before, Chris wears many hats. Among them are Cranio-Sacral therapist.
Yeah.
We'll talk about Cranio-Sacral in a while. Astrologer. And more recently, psychotherapist.
Yeah, so I'm actually, our graduation is next weekend. So it's complete and not complete. I'm in that sort of window. But yeah, just at the completion of that, which sort of adds this whole other dynamic to what I'm offering. So it's been 2 years of pretty deep learning. It's been a beautiful learning, and that's been, the psychotherapy has been this way to weave together the other things that I do. Ow, that dog's.
Des is always, you also hear, you can't quite see him on the camera, but he's got very sharp teeth. Well, I want to speak a little bit about the way that the more esoteric arts are kind of combining with you in the more traditional arts. Come here, Des. But first, I'd like to know, especially for people that are kind of outside of the world, they ask you what you do. And let's say you don't have that long to tell them. Like, it's not a full low-down description. Like, how do you get across what you do to people that don't know?
Yeah, that's difficult. I mean, that tends to be a case-by-case, person-by-person conversation these days, because one of the things is just to feel into what that person is already open to discussing, in a way. People that have been around, say, the more esoteric levels of working with people and working with energy, working with consciousness, working with reality. I think we come up against that other paradigm that says, no, that's not real, or that's not true, or that's not a thing, and we get used to sort of meeting that as a block, in a way, or especially when we are working in this every day, we experience the true reality of what we're doing every day, and the depth to which you can work. So my first answer to that would be very personal to the person I'm speaking to be honest. So I get a feel for, like, what is this person open to experiencing, what have they already experienced, and just kind of let my intuition guide that.
You kind of meet them where they're at.
Meet them where they're at, because otherwise there's no point. I'm not going to argue with somebody about nature of consciousness, although I do sometimes. Also, that's a meeting where they're at.
It's, it reminds me, I see what you're saying, because I would say a few years ago when we first met, I was, how do I put it? Anti-spiritual, perhaps, might be a word, or I was kind of the annoying person in the room that would often, especially when I first got here, even before you got here, the person that would annoyingly argue logically out of the existence of energy or energy healers or astrology or ghosts or UFOs, basically any of these topics. And one of the gifts that you've given me, and you're a big part of it, in particular, was seeing that the veracity, the truth on a logical, rational level was way less important than the ability to read and divine information that applied to my life. And that opened up a lot of space to be moving into more of the mystic realms of myth and story. And I have a question for you, because like you're an interesting human to me, because there's a lot of people in the energetic world that kind of support the bias that I used to have, and many people watching will have, that when it comes to I just thought it was a sound thing. Good to have you, Anna. When it comes to doing work similar to you, they enforce some of the stereotypes of being perhaps a little bit fluffy and a little bit like out there, and like it's much harder gap to bridge from someone that doesn't believe when the person is showing up as all the stereotypes. But with you, you tend to show up as just a generally good, like, Australian dude. Like, I'm sure we would have hung out if we were in high school together kind of situation, you know?
For sure, yeah.
So what I want to know is, obviously you grew up in Australia. You did pretty normal things, like didn't you teach English overseas, and you're a high school teacher, primary school teacher?
Well, I taught English in kindergarten, actually.
It was kindergarten.
A kindergarten teacher, yeah, for 5.5 years.
So that's a very far cry from astrologer and from psychotherapist.
Yeah, and I studied marketing and economics at university.
Which is even one step further.
Yes, I have a degree in that.
So tell me,
back there.
So tell me this: when was the first time you remember connecting to the other, or having some sense that there was something else there that you needed to do?
Well, actually, it was the memory that I have that was most profound was leaving Australia, leaving Perth, and leaving my friends there, and everything that was there. It was beautiful. I had a really good thing going for me in Perth. And then I went traveling. I actually went to Greece. That was the first kind of stop that I made. And I had about 5 days between when my friends were going to meet us in Eos, which is kind of like party island place, and my arrival. So just happened to be these 5 days. And I think still to this day, those 5 days just are so remarkable in the way that the people that I met randomly by chance, and you know how each person that I was meeting was weaving into this storyline, and we ended up meeting a Greek guy from Melbourne who has this other set of islands in the Greek islands, and he took us to like his home island. And I got this much deeper experience of Greece and Greek life and island life and families there and all of that. And then it was like I wove away from him to end up drinking ouzo on the rooftop in the full moon with this Swedish writer who was just waxing poetical about life, the universe, and everything. And these days were so rich, like every moment of it so rich. One moment where we're under the Acropolis again, the moon is still very full, and we're dancing and having this incredible time. And then when I went to see my friends, it was like, oh, and then there's this. Well, it was like two realities opened up. One was this kind of almost Taoist path that I didn't have the words for then, but it was like the pathless path that I was following. But then there was always another door open, which was much more kind of like, hey, this is what we do, this is what we're about. This is our more rational, linear path. And I've felt all through my life that there's still and always perhaps will be rational, linear path, and also this other. I think Jung talks about it actually. I'll paraphrase him a little bit of in his memoirs. He says that he knows he's been through the Valley of Diamonds, but when he gets back, he reaches into his pocket and it can only bring out gravel. And this is a really apt metaphor for what it feels like. You know that you've been to somewhere really magical, and there's no denying it in your own felt experience of something absolutely beyond the rational in this world. And yet, and this is why it's difficult, this is why the question, which is, what do you tell people what you do, is actually a much more complex question, right? Because I'm like, well, here I got these diamonds from the Valley of Diamonds, and you just see the gravel, right? And so it takes something there of the dancing in between these worlds in a way. And I think that was my early 20s, and I'm 40 now. So it's been a really long journey, and since then of weaving these worlds. I don't think the rational world is wrong, and that's not where I come from at all. It's very important, but I think it's in service to the I think it's a thin sliver, the rational world, and it's in service to a much greater thing that I would call reality, or whatever you want to call that. It's in service to this much greater thing that doesn't work off of such logical frameworks.
It's an interesting thing, that juxtaposition that you speak of. Because it's very easy, I guess, if you stay in the same paradigm, not to realize the edges of that paradigm. And I relate in some ways to what you say. And I'm sure a lot of people listening can as well, where you have a deep connected experience of one kind and feel the diamonds as you speak. And then you go back to your normal reality and suddenly all there is gravel. I think it happens a lot here in Ubud. It happens on our training sometimes. People will reach out afterwards. It's like, well, everything's the same but feels totally different.
And one element of that is I can't convince others, and I almost can't convince myself that I was in the Valley of Diamonds. I almost can't convince myself of that, which is the scary thing, that the mind or the psyche can like shut down entire experiences and just lock back down into that one paradigm again. So what did you do following this? It sounds like that was kind of the first crack into the opening in a way. I'm sure there was many more before then. But what did you do when you went back to your normal life and you were like, well, I currently know the paradigm and I know outside of it, I know the rational and the mystic, or whatever words you want to put onto it. Did it go fully back into the rational? Did it stay open? Did you like, I need to go do a shaman course in Peru, or like what was the process that moved you more towards here? I guess at the heart of this, if I'm going to be honest with you, is of course, like everybody, I want to belong, and when I went back home, belonging to a certain extent meant, hey, come back into this paradigm and be here. And some friends were more kind of like, yeah, that's really interesting, and go with that. And some friends were like, well, I don't know what you're talking about, and it's a little bit weird. And, like that whole occult world can be scary for people. It's like, that seems really odd. I don't like that. I want the old Skiddy or whoever I was. Like I had my whole persona built around. I had my whole persona built around being fun and all of these kinds of things and I still have that side of me. It's not like that went anywhere, but I've
seen it.
You've seen it, yeah.
Chris is also, a lot to his titles, is also quite a badass DJ.
That's one of the things. and I've always enjoyed that, but I just didn't want to make it the central thing. And then I feel like there's a true scientist in me that is hypothesis testing all the time, and like weighing things and going like, which of these paths like make sense to me, and in the end the path of exploration and opening and let's just, like in the 20s it was just like arrive at somewhere that you don't know where you are and see what happens next. So I didn't go towards like, okay, so now I know about this, I'll go and do this course and that course. It wasn't like that for me. It was where can I sort of fling myself into the unknown and just see if I sink or swim. That's what it felt like in the 20s. And out of that, flinging in very odd places like Cheltenham in England was one place that I went and started working in a bar and met a psychic there.
As a customer or a fellow employee?
Sure, she was the partner of the chef.
Okay.
And I still remember to this day us locking eyes over the bar and being like, whoa, almost like a locking of eyes, and then suddenly all this information just drops in. And I knew exactly who she was. I hadn't met her before, but I knew exactly who she was, and she was 22 years older than me, and to the day actually, because we had the same birthday. And it was like for 3 months she just started teaching me about what it is to be a psychic medium. And that's the kind of thing, like somebody tells you a psychic medium and you could say you're a liar, which is often, in that old paradigm we're talking about. It's like something is, the logic can be, it's not true because it can't be true. That's the underlying logic.
And it's also binary, right?
Yeah.
It's yes or no.
It's true, false. Yeah, yes or no. So it's not true because it can't be true. And I get that because I came from that too. Like I get that 100% why that mind would be there. And then also I was like, what if I move this way slightly and say, tell me about that. She's doing this every day. Tell me about what it is to be a psychic medium. And that just opens up this other world. as soon as I was participating in the mystery that she was telling me about, it opened up for me. But if I did not participate in that mystery, it would not open up for me. These are the sorts of moments where my first instinctual reaction was, that's fascinating. And it wasn't, that's nonsense, or that's something that can't be real, or you're just you're a charlatan, or all of the different storylines that I know about so well, especially these days after 18 years later. I hear all of those in the background. But then if you do participate in that mystical experience, I mean, she was able to teach me almost like these pathways leading off of my dominant paradigm. Like, just come over here a little bit and check this out.
That's a beautiful way to invite you into it. It reminds me a little, there's a Roald Dahl quote, those that don't believe in magic will never find it.
Because there is a participatory
nature
element to it. And if we decide not to participate, it doesn't participate with that, that's done. Cool, no problem. Which brings us to that sort of the idea of the objective observer. And if that's even a possibility. Yet we've built enormous amounts of science around it, and we don't really know that that's real, that that's possible to have an objective observer. We know how to sort of be cold to what we're witnessing, but then if we're warm to what we're witnessing, so much more sort of life and information comes up. So that her name is Karen, and was the first of a series of mystic teachers for me.
Awesome. I want to guide us a little bit in a moment to the other space, the non-rational space, and I think you've got a particularly interesting way to get people there. Before we do, something that reminds me of on the trainings, there's a very simple life philosophy I sometimes bring across. It's feather brick truck. Have you heard this? You know this one,
well,
right?
I've heard you speak on it.
So some people might not have heard it. It's like the universe is conspiring in your favor, and they'll either do it in one of three ways, and they'll help nudge you with the feather, and if you don't listen to the feathers, and you get hit with a brick, and if you don't listen to the bricks, you get hit by a truck. And then I can say, how many people can recognize some feathers, and there'll be hands. How many people see their bricks, and how many people see their trucks? And one thing that's interesting about it is if people tend to love it, and it's immediately applicable, but no one ever says, that's not true. Because it's not meant to be. It's so far out of it. No one goes, there's no such thing as a cosmic truck that hits me. They just go, oh, I see the point that in my life, that metaphor applies to things that I've had. And I think this is where, at least in my own experience, I used to shut myself off from the potential of anything, whether it's astro or tarot or divining from nature, by saying, well, that doesn't exist. Without realizing that it's exactly the same thing as the cosmic truck.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Right, yeah.
And it opens up a little more space. And I think one thing that you do in particular that I've experienced helped me understand at least different states of my own consciousness, and we've talked about this quite a lot, was through cranial and the tides. And it's that wonderful thing is you could sit down and describe to me the deep healing space of whatever the long tide is, this deep state, and you could tell me all about it, and if I was rational, I would ask questions and probably not believe it. Or you can put me on the table, and if you're not familiar with cranio, basically, Chris will explain it better, but it's non-invasive, it's fingertips of hand, the lightest touch in the world, and every single time I go into a totally different space and depth of consciousness. And by the end of it, I can't say, well, that wasn't real, because I'd had the experience in my body and had the experience in my system. So I wonder if you could, just to give those that aren't familiar with this paradigm of Cranio-Sacral, just the basics of what it is. And then also if you could describe the tides, because I found that really helpful to get a grasp on it.
So Cranio-Sacral is a really tough one to describe and explain, I think, because of this very thing that we're talking about, of describing something that you may not have experienced, which is tricky. But but I think the work is really in the same way as this participation mystique piece that we're talking about, consciousness participating with nature, and the body is nature. And our consciousness can participate in the opening of enormous amounts of things, actually. The body's constantly holding all sorts of little micro things and, tension points and the different things that we have in our system that are just little, we can put that, and Cranio-Sacral therapists often do put that in very anatomical terms. And I feel like that's kind of playing with trying to make ourselves more rational sounding.
Yes, makes sense.
And yet what you're talking about is we go to the table, we put hands on, we go to a different experience, you drop into something that we might call the mid-tide or long tide, where your system drops down. In that the parasympathetic nervous system starts to activate, which is rest and restore, and it begins to do its maintenance program right there on the table. So it's doing deep layers of healing that we didn't even know we needed or didn't even know was there, but it's going closer and closer to the root, in a sense. And so Cranio-Sacral, well, I think I've obviously spent many years trying to answer what it is, and I'm not sure I completely know still. But I do know that the type of work that I'm working with is called biodynamic, in that it's working with the aliveness of the system, and it's very non-invasive. So it's just the power of attention, the power of bringing consciousness to, the power of awareness, however you want to put that. But if we can bring a clean, clear awareness to something that's happening in your body being intelligent will also hear that reflection and begin to change. That's it. Like, once your system hears a reflection of what's going on in it that it couldn't otherwise get, it begins to go, oh, and it thinks, well, I might have another option but that. I maybe don't need to hold this thing like this, right? If we see, I guess a good example is if I see that my fist is like this, right? But I haven't sort of really paid attention to it. I've talked the whole time with you, but my fist is like this. And you say to me, like, geez, you can see that your fist is like that, right? Like, you kind of look at that, and I see you look at that, and I'm like, oh. And then maybe I'm like, oh, well, I may have another option, but to hold that amount of tension there. And some of that is on the rational level. So the tides come into this of the CRI is craniorhythmic impulse, which is the sort of surface layer where a lot more of the gross movements are happening, and a lot more of the conscious awareness stuff is there as well. Now, that's just like the surface layer of reality. And so oftentimes we're trying to sort it out there. We have a problem and we're trying to work it out there, which comes back to a rational conversation, right? Like, there's my problem, I want to sort it out. Let's just fix it and get it done. But who knows the tapestry of that problem, how deep it may weave through not only your physical structures, but your whole life, and who knows how far back into your life this goes, into memory or experience. And then beyond that, if we want to get a bit further into that, we may look at ancestral patternings that you're holding in your body. We may look at your soul's patternings that we're holding through many lives. And you see how I go from there to now I'm talking about past lives. And we may have listeners like, I'm not into that. And to me it's like, but it's the same basic tapestry, it's the same basic conversation. And we all have that place of like, that's too far for me.
Yeah, can I give an example for this?
Yeah, please.
It's a gross example, but it's not quite as subtle though. Last time I was on your table, I've been dealing with this rotation in my spine, and those of you that know me is that I'm a mover. It's what I do for my job. I've done a lot of, and it's what I do for my passion. I move all the time. I'm very, very aware of the imbalances in my body. So I had this rotation, which is a common pattern, and it rotates my spine out this way. Now when I'm in the conscious level, I know there's certain muscles I need to undo, and I also need to rotate back this way. But on a physical level, it takes a rotation this way, which is, for whatever reason is there, then I create another pattern over top of that to go like this, and then I get confused why I'm not feeling relief in my spine and my back, right? Because on the gross level, it's just these muscles that are tightening to fix it. So nothing I was really doing was fixing it, and it was in the middle of quite a stressful time for me in the teacher trainings. So I came to you, and like as soon as I hit like the mid to long tide, I just felt my head, neck, shoulders, and spine go. But there was no force behind it. There was no pressing behind it. There was no massage. It just totally released. So it's very easy to see on the rational level, on the gross muscular structure, oh, you have this, we'll do this. But it was nothing to do with that. It was, let's say, potentially a central nervous system issue, where my body knew the right shape to go into, and you helped to remind, just like this example. But then perhaps taking it a step further, it could be, it's in a time of stress for me, it could go back to something that I deal with stress from when I was a child or a teenager, that experience that is locked in my central nervous system. So when my body experiences that sensation, it takes away. And it can go further, as you say, back into past lives or whatever it might be. So there's a chain of events, and it just seems like the cranio work tends to go down to the more deeper and more subtle levels.
Yeah, and it's almost like with cranio, and this is why I love this is why I love that particular type of work. And even though I've gone into psychotherapy and the astrology and everything, it's I'll always hold Cranio-Sacral as a beautiful sacred art, because it just, in cranio you go, it doesn't matter, we don't need to know. So even though I'm talking about all those different layers, it's still like the question to come back to the central piece might be like, oh, where's the healing? And in your situation there, yeah, you can see, I mean, you displayed it perfectly as a movie, you could show us that. And then you go down to that level where, oh, that doesn't really matter. Oh, hang on, wait. Right? Like, and your body, I always kind of think about this, your body found its way into that mess and knows how to find its way out. Only your body does. So if you're thinking like, oh, wow, here I go, and then I'll move this, and then I'll move that, and then I'll move that, that's maybe just layering on more stuff over the top of that the body has to eventually go and unwind again. I want to sort of take this moment to say there's people working at all of the different levels, and I respect all of the different work, actually.
They're all necessary.
And that's been something that I've really learned over the years. So I don't say, but that's not okay, and that, right, people are doing all sorts of different things, and sometimes I just need to talk through something with someone, and that's where the psychotherapy, much more surface, maybe not even embodied, can be very useful. And then sometimes it's like, okay, this is in my body, but it's not that deep. I just need to work something out quite consciously. And sometimes it's like, oh no, so any of that's not really going to work. You know, when a massage just doesn't work anymore, it's like, oh, that's not giving me what I need. And then sometimes it's exactly what I needed, and I feel great.
Totally.
But sometimes like, that's not quite it. So with this, maybe in my path, as I'm talking about it with you, it becomes clear in a sense to me that I'm trying to with my life and with this life path, trying to cover as much of that as I can, which is why I've come up to learn psychotherapy. I've learned the astrology, which is a whole different conversation we'll get to, and the biodynamic work, which takes us into the very basic, very yin, very feminine, just sit with and be with, and that's enough. Just sit with and be with. And when your whole system gets heard in that way that's clear, one of the things is like, I can't want to change it. So even when I saw that shape, it's like, as soon as I want to change it, we're stuck.
We actually had a session like this, where I was trying to change and you were trying to change, and it just didn't work, right?
No,
like, it just totally didn't work. It was like, it was wild, and this is where this stuff gets a little trippy. It's like, after a session, I haven't said a word, but then we can have a conversation about my state of consciousness where your experience mapped to my experience. And just to give you all an interesting story behind this one as well, is there's a time, this was early on, at the end of it, we're just chatting away, and then kind of as an offside, you went, oh, you were a forceps baby? As in, when you were a baby that had to use the forceps to help with birth. I don't know if they use them anymore, but it was when I was born. And I'm like, no. And I thought about it. I'm like, I don't think so. I just happened to be speaking to Mum that night, and I'm like, Mum, was I a forceps baby? She goes, yeah, you were. And I was just like, what a weird affirmation of whatever it is that you're picking up, and that helps my rational mind relax a little bit and be like, obviously there was something there. But that's where it gets a little bit trippy, and that's, to circle it back to what we were speaking of before, the linear world and the mystical world. There's all sorts of information and messages in those mid and long tides. that we can glean out. And I want you to say more on them, though, just to give people that haven't experienced it before. I relate this to falling asleep before I fall asleep. So if I lay down and there's a moment after my mind's calmed, however long it is, and my thoughts start to go sideways, and then if I catch myself thinking the thought and being like, oh, that's interesting, that feels like the mid-tide, I drop down and I come out. The long tide for me, and this is more on the table than before falling asleep, then I stay in that space, and it's not an absence of thought. There are very strange patterns and images, kind of like a dream. And none of them I don't stick into any of them. They just flow. So I'm not aware of them until afterwards, and I can kind of reach back and get some idea, but like trying to tell someone a dream. So what is that? What is that space? What is that thing?
Well, what's really cool about this is that in these last 2 years I've been studying at a school called Metavision, which is in Bowral in New South Wales, and Metavision, one of the things that they base their work off is the work of a guy called Arnie Mindell, and he is in Portland, Oregon, still alive actually, still doing his thing. He was a theoretical physicist that then went to the Jungian Institute, and in his experience with the Jungian Institute, and even working with Marie-Louise von Franz, who's one of the great Jungian analysts, an incredible path that he had, and he brought back with him this way of working with consciousness and reality in a different way. But one thing he saw in the Jung Institute is like, it doesn't seem embodied enough for me. So he went and really worked on, like, how do we get this stuff and go into the body? And one of his frameworks, and this will come back to the tides now, because as I'm learning about this, I'm like, wow, these guys are talking about the tide. It took me about a year's worth of study to go, hang on, this is the same basic framework as what I find in my biodynamics. So the top level of reality he refers to as consensus reality. That's the reality, but that we also can agree on, that, here we are, you're there, I'm here, there's a couch here, there's coconut water here, those things that we can just say, yes, that's real. We can all say consensus says that that's real. And interestingly enough, consensus reality, CR, which is CRI over the other side of craniorhythmic impulse. So just a really interesting little synchronicity of what felt like it linked those two together. Now in the cranio, we drop out of that world, like you said, almost like going into a sleep pattern, but it's just like, I think about it maybe as drifting back out of the frontal cortex and then into the back brain a little, or something like that.
For sure.
Of like, oh, we're going back, and in that space things become much more symbolic, mythic, patterned. You can't really speak on them in the way that you could in consensus reality. In the same way, it's like, now we're in the place of this truck, and in consensus reality it's like, there's a truck, is there? And then down in this dream world, it's like, yeah, the truck. Now, and then there's a different way of taking in reality in what Arnie calls the dream world, which is taking a bit from some of the indigenous cultures here, dream time in the Aboriginal cultures and things like this, of the dropping into a different state of consciousness. And that's what happens on the table when you're dropping into, like, now that you're in, so the mechanics of it, that's a tricky one to talk on, but that you drop down can be not really argued against in a way, because you've experienced it. You know what it's like to drop down and underneath the surface layer, which is that CR, consensus reality level. In that world, we are dealing with much more of the mythic. And this is why over the last few years, as you know, I've gone much more into mythology, fairy tales, and basically gathering up myth, gathering it up and sitting with stories and old stories, because these stories talk about this level of reality. And then when both of these drop out from the dream world down, it goes into essence level. This is in Arnie's thing. So then essence level, it's hard to even speak on it, because everything's sort of merged into oneness consciousness down there. It's like a unity consciousness place. And the same with cranio, when you drop into a long tide experience, which you have many times actually on the table. Which in your own kind of arc with Cranio, I remember our first session was nowhere near that kind of level. And then over the sessions that we've had over the years, it's like, you're like, hey man, I just need to get plugged into some serious long tide experience. I'm like, yeah, come over, let's do that, right? Like that's become part of your world now, and that we can go and do that. But when we drop down there, you'll feel it like that essence level. We can't say much about it when you come back. It's like you end up saying things like, wow. Yeah, whoa.
What the fuck?
Yeah, but something really deep happened there. Something transformed down there, though I couldn't quite put a name to it. And when I come back up to the consensus reality level or the CRI level, maybe that symptom that I had before is gone, and maybe it's just kind of like, whew, it's been cleared now. I don't really have to think about that anymore. Or a fear, or something that was really bugging me, or something in a relationship that I couldn't handle. And that's where it gets pretty trippy as well, because you can go back to that relationship after that experience and see that field shifted too.
Yeah.
So I think the tapestry really comes in there of like, what is reality and how does everything fit into everything else? And how do we even begin talking about that without getting stuck on a Cartesian split kind of like, the world is dead paradigm. Like if we get stuck on that level, we can't even have these conversations really. We get stuck on what we would call the consensus reality level.
It's can I say a couple of points to that?
Please.
Yeah, one is just to note on the more ease with me dropping into it. I had a acupuncture session with Ibuayu. She came over a while ago.
Yeah.
And she puts me on the table and puts a few needles in me, and then woof, straight away I was gone for 45 minutes. Come back out, she's like, how was that? I'm like, oh, I went totally somewhere else. She's like, oh, you a yoga teacher, meditation teacher? And I go, yeah, actually. And she said, it's something very common with people in yoga and meditation, that they move into that access space more easily. And for me, it's that plus the work that I've done. I could already recognize it. Like I knew the shape of the space to fall into. But it is interesting that it's been a little like a muscle for me. It's something that can be developed, and Cranio is one way to get there. Acupuncture can be another way. Shavasana is obviously a way. And it also seems very true. You mentioned the Aboriginal Australians, but the same thing with almost any Aboriginal culture that had a shamanistic flavor. It seems like the states that they talk about going into, and they have everything from psychedelics to ritual to ceremony to fasting, to move into that space. And perhaps I'd just be curious to see what you think of this. Is the shamans are the ones that perhaps can access it more easily and interpret it more clearly. Because as you say, it's so difficult to bring anything back from that deep space. It's like it's like you have to use the rational level words to describe that thing. That's why poetry will always be moving around the thing rather than into the thing. That's just a side note, but I lost the other thread.
Well, I think it's the difference between the literal and the lateral, and I think our language does give us access. Actually, we can't really blame the language, although it's easy to. I've been reading about ancient Greece and their language having these layers to it that we can't really comprehend right now with our particular language, and but we can. English is versatile like that. We can speak. We can make up words, and we can wander off into the more mythic realm, and that's why, I feel like we have that there. It's the issue can be when, because I want to speak on that I'm not denying consensus reality. That's a very important part of reality, and if we didn't have a consensus reality, we'd have this sort of like chaotic, I don't want to be in a trip the whole time, right? That would be not the kind of world I'd actually want to be in. I want to be able to dip into that world and come back out, but I like that we have this way, because then we can all communicate, we can all understand what's going on a certain way. It's only when that layer rejects the other layers.
Yes.
And that is really that has a lot of troublesome consequences, actually. I really do feel that you know, we've talked about it. We're also in a book club together and talk about a lot of different things in that, but you know, the war on the imagination and how we're sort of stopped before we can really drift and dream and wander off into those mythic realms, and school being a part of that, and our work being a part of that, if we don't wander off here to Bali or do something else. But that it's like, keep coming back to this, and this is the real world, and it involves money and it involves this and that, you know, these layers of reality, and then it stops here and there's nothing else to think about.
Yeah.
And I think that's really troublesome for the human psyche, to not be able to, in the same way, like for me, and now doing a lot of Cranio-Sacral myself and having a lot of very skilled practitioners having worked on me over the years, I know when I haven't touched down into the deeper pools.
Yeah.
And it's affecting my entire reality. It's if I haven't, like, all sorts of symptoms can come off of that one thing of it. I just haven't touched back in for too long. Like, I haven't gone back to source, we might call that, for too long, and the world's getting a bit like zzz for me.
It's a quote I saw the other day. It's like, if I don't plug my phone back into source regularly, then it loses its power, and so do I.
Right.
If I don't plug back into source.
Right.
And it reminded me of the other thing I was going to say, which pertains to this. And it's a flavor like most people can relate, of drinking too much coffee, and being very cerebral, and then being focused on a problem that won't go away, that can't go away in the moment, but the thought still continues. A lot of people at the moment will be experiencing this around anxiety, around world states and COVID right now. So it's like this fixation, a mental fixation, where the thing gets mulled at the front of the head. And what I find with that, the long tide states of dropping down and laterally, just for, doesn't even 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever it is, that when I come back up to consensus reality, or reality, the problem hasn't gone away, but it's no longer here and omnipresent, and it's there, but you know, so are the trees, and so is my partner, and so is the food, and I can have an existence that's bigger than just this fixation. Does that make sense?
Definitely makes sense. And I think that's the thing, right? We get fixated, and because of the if we deny those other levels of reality, we can only deal with the measurable world, because that's the consensus reality world, and so then we have to do it in very measurable ways.
Yes, of course.
And so once a measurable thing comes along, like COVID is a very measurable thing, even though it's coming from the invisible world, then we can have very rational ways of dealing with that. And it's like, okay, clear, we know exactly what to do, because it's this rational way. And then we can get into the sort of like collective rational way of handling something. And it's sort of like Hercules' battle with the Hydra, right? We cut off one head, and up to 9. I mean, there's different versions of the story where 2 appear. I like it when it gets a bit more extravagant, when there's 9
exponential growth.
Yeah. You cut off one and 9 more appear, right? It's like, and I think we're going to, it's interesting to watch that. Yeah, okay, we'll be able to handle this one thing, and then what about the 9 that appear out of it, right? It's like, because we just have the tools to deal with things on that level, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Like, you know, we can look through history of what has shut down the mystical world, and all of the different ways that has been shut down through time. But you can see it's not so much in the dialogue, the regular dialogue that we talk about. Say the world's soul may be sick right now, or you know, what's happening to the lungs of the world's soul right now, as 3 big events in the Amazon and Australia, and now in COVID, have attacked the lungs in one way or another. Like, you know, what is it about that we could perhaps sit with for a little while, just like sit with for a bit? The lungs in Chinese medicine, meaning grief, is this a deep release grieving process that's happening? And what I find is there's often like an antagonism towards that way of thinking, that is like, no, we have a problem here, we have to fix it. Yes,
for sure.
And then you go like, well, okay, maybe I should not speak on that. It seems to be causing more trouble for people when they, you know, but it's like, hey, but in the same way, we're locked in here.
Yeah.
And we know what it's like on an individual level to drop back to here and go, okay, let's just take a little perspective on this thing. but on the collective level, we sort of like we cannot afford that.
It's so funny. Megan was just in she's part of Ubud community leaders around quarantining and isolation. And they jumped on a Zoom call, the first Zoom call, and there's 12, 15 people, and they're all trying to figure out how to best help each other and help the community, which is a really beautiful intention.
Yeah.
And they jumped straight away and they're like, all right, what are we going to do? And Megan's like, hey, guys, you want to just check in and see how everyone's feeling? I'm like, no, we've got no time for that. We need to speak into it. And they go, and then Megan another time kind of stepped in, and this is, I think, a smaller example than what you're saying, obviously, but just like, hey, what about checking in on how people are doing right now in isolation, how they're feeling? Do they feel lonely? And it's not to take away from all of the actions that need to happen, but collectively on the call there was kind of a there's other stuff. It's not just action. There's something deeper, and how deep does that deepness go? Right? Because that's one level, and now you're talking about the world level. As Terry Pratchett would say, there's elephants all the way down. I think. Was it turtles? The elephants were on top of the turtles.
Okay, yeah.
And it was turtles all the way down.
Yeah.
So this is where I think myth becomes interesting, because I don't know. Maybe we disagree on this slightly, though. I like the Wittgensteinian idea that language is really, really good, except for the things that matter a lot. So I can talk about this glass, I can talk about this, and I can say the word love. But when I'm actually trying to use words to describe what I feel as God, or what I feel as love, or after having a journey of some description, whatever that is, where you reach a totally different state, coming out of that, the best I feel I can do is, here's the thing, and I can come around and into it and kind of touch on it, but I can never really give it like I could give it as a glass. And this is where I think poets and musicians are so necessary, because the better and deep philosophers like Alan Watts is wonderful at getting closer to that thing, or whoever it might be that you aspire to in that realm. And I think this is where the realm of myth and story are becoming more interesting to me recently, is because they don't tend to say, here's what the thing is. This is what you do about it. They present a situation and a scenario that on one level is very simple, but then on another level there's all sorts of other deeper learnings, which is exactly why so many myths have lasted for so long. So I'm wondering if you can give an example of one of your favorite stories or myths, and give the interpretive view of it that might be a little different than what people are used to.
Well, I mean, the thing that comes up for me, because I've been discussing this over the last week with a friend of mine, is one of my favorite fairy tales, actually. I will, before I go into the fairy tale, just to speak on that, I think we're agreeing on that there's certain levels that are just really hard to handle with language, and maybe this is why I think that we, as alternative therapists and these kinds of terms like complementary and alternative, which are a little derogatory towards us because it means like we're just this adjunct or add-on over here. I think rather, the concept of the healing arts, and there is an artistic, poetic element to healing that is kind of like shunned out of the main, no, healing and medicine is this. It's very kind of like focused on that. And the healing arts gives a lot more room, and there's so many people in the world in the healing arts, whether it's art therapists or a lot of the psychotherapeutic stuff. It's very much like the feminine principles are at play there, rather than this masculine linear, like, find bad thing, destroy bad thing. So one of the fairy tales I go to a lot, because it's always the number one story in the Grimm brothers collections. So of all of the collections that they've made, and they made like many different iterations of different stories, they always have a number one, and they always have a final one. So the number one is always the Frog King, and the final one is always the Golden Key, because the Golden Key is hardly even a myth. It just kind of goes, it's sort of like, you found this golden key, and then you found this trunk, and actually it fits perfectly in there, and you turn it and it opens, and then it ends the book.
Oh, it's Pulp Fiction.
It's Pulp Fiction?
With the is it, no, not Pulp Fiction. Is it? What's the suitcase that has the golden light in it? No one knows what it is.
Oh wow, I don't know.
I think it is Pulp Fiction. Someone will correct me on this. It's one of the movies, and but there's different fan theories about it. Someone's soul, and like no one knows what it is.
It is Pulp Fiction.
It is Pulp Fiction, right?
Right. So that he's actually drawing from. Tarantino may have been drawing from the Golden Key. So the Frog King is a really interesting one because I've worked with many people through therapy on this. It's an example of how a myth or a story or a fairy tale can be passed down. Actually, the Grimms didn't call them fairy tales; they called them magic stories, which I kind of like a little bit better. You know, there were fairy tales in them, but a lot of them were definitely not. You know, they're Grimm for a reason. These brothers.
Was it actually their name? Or was
it was actually their name.
Oh, okay.
But at the same time, sometimes you get very apt names. In the original version, although it's hard to say what the original is because even they were collecting from an oral tradition, but the first versions of the Frog King is very different to the one that we get handed down now, which is the Frog Prince. And I just ask you, do you know the sort of general story of the Frog Prince and what happens?
This is the one where she kisses the frog and he turns into a prince?
Bingo, that's the one. So that's what we know in this day and age, that she kisses the frog and the frog turns into a prince. Now in the original, she's down beside a dark forest. I'll just go into this a little bit because it's a case in point in a way. She's next to a dark forest and there's a well there. And immediately you know from this story there's something dark. If you're next to the dark forest, there's no need to put the dark forest into this story except for to say something a little bit messed up is about to happen. Something dark is going on. It's meant to put us a little on edge that we have a little girl, the youngest daughter, the fairest of the three daughters, and she's gone down to the well and that she's beside a dark forest. There's a disturbing element to it. We kind of go, oh, something's happening here that's not so cool. She's playing with her ball. She loses the ball. The frog comes up and says, hey, I can go get that for you. She's weeping, by the way, so she really loves this golden ball. And the golden ball can be that symbol of innocence or soul, or that sense of calling as well can be in the golden ball. The golden ball is like in astrology the sun, and who we are in our essential spirit and what we're trying to grow into. All of these kinds of concepts come through that golden ball. So even though we're only a few lines into the story, we have a lot going on. And the frog says, I'll go and get that for you if. And so the frog's trying to draw up a contract with this little girl. So there's something disturbing happening here. This is not cool, what's going on here. But he says, you know, I'll go and get that for you if I can share your little golden plate, and also if I can come into the palace, and also if I can share your pillow. And again, we know that we're talking about something quite disturbing. We're talking about a slimy, froggy, gross energy. Now, if we fast forward to the modern day story, we know we're supposed to kiss this frog at some point in order to break its spell and release a prince. Now, what kind of story is that? If I've given you the context of this story, what it's about right now, it seems like a very unwise thing to do, to kiss this frog, to move towards the frog in that kind of like loving, compassionate way. Doesn't feel like a very smart message to be giving little girls, or to be giving any of us really, when we come in the face of a slimy frog-like energy.
It's kind of like saying, yes, take the candy from the stranger.
That's right. It is exactly like saying that. And so what happens later in the story is that the frog gets the ball and she goes, whatever, frog. He says, don't forget about the promise. And she goes, yeah, whatever. Walks away, like, stupid frog, can't be in a palace. And then the frog comes to the front door, knocks on the door. She's like, oh my God, it's a frog. Close the door, it comes back, and the king's like, what was that? What's going on? Why is there a frog there? And she said, oh, well, you know, I lost my golden ball. I just wanted it back. I just agreed to whatever he said. And the king says, well, now you have to go through with your contract. Which, if the king's a father figure, that's pretty messed up. And if the king is a societal figure, that's even more messed up. Right? If that is the law of the land, that one has to go through with the thing that one agrees to, even as a minor and even as an innocent, you have to go through with this thing. It's like the king takes the side of the frog. Again, quite disturbing. Now, the frog eats at the golden plate, and then he's like, okay, I'm tired now, I want to go to bed. And she's like, ugh. And the king says, you must take the frog with you. Again, pretty messed up. She takes it by 2 fingers and puts it in the room. And she's like, don't come near me, frog. And then later on, the frog's like, yeah, but I want to come a little closer. And there's a few different versions of this, quite a lot of different versions of this. But basically, the frog says, let me share your pillow. And she's like, no. But then gets closer and closer, let me have a kiss. And the frog and the princess says, okay, enough. And she stands up in this really powerful moment in the story, grabs the frog and throws the frog with all of her might against the wall, splat against the wall. And in that moment, the king is revealed. And the king comes out and it says, wow, you freed me from this spell. I was put under a spell by an evil witch
not the father
many
king.
Moons ago. Not
yeah,
the father
just to be
king.
clear.
A king is revealed out of this frog who's been put under a spell. And once that king is revealed, then they are together, that we can imagine the fairy tale speeding up here and there, and now there's a union possible. So what's the difference between I'll kiss a lot of frogs or show up and say, no, that's not okay behavior? So I work with this in therapy because I work with a lot of women actually in my work, maybe something like 85% these days. Maybe that's a product of being in Ubud, I'm not sure what that is. But part of that is to be able to say, hey, this whole concept of kissing the frog, we don't have to be conspiratorial about it, we just know it's wrong. It's not the right approach. And can we then think mythologically, which comes back to the original point, rather than think literally, okay, I have to go out and be a warrior of some kind, I have to go and be literal about that and start to attack
throw men against
walls, all this kind of stuff. It's like, can we think metaphorically enough?
Yeah.
Can we think mythologically? And that's the different mind that can come in and go, yeah, there have been moments in my life where I have accepted the frog-like behavior into my life. I have kissed the frog. I have said that's okay, and that really hasn't worked for me. And that's what we'll work through in our process. It's like, yeah, that really doesn't work. Oh, there's another option. It involves a little bit more like
grit
energy. It involves like standing up for myself and standing for my self-worth and not playing into any of those games. And so the story is it's actually a very deep story. It's the number 1, like I said, in the collection. And even the Grimms had changed it to a kiss by the end of so they had already changed it. So you can see the sort of Christian puritanical stuff coming in as they're doing their different versions over the course of about 40 years. So but in those first versions it was like that. Later on it became a kiss or something like the frog went under the pillow and then came out a king and these kinds of things. But so it's not necessarily that we can even blame Disney on that or anything like that. It's just that somewhere along the line it changes, and I'll leave people listening to decide how that happens, why it changes from such a strong feminine move to such a compliant move over the years.
So interesting. It's like it kind of slots up exactly what we've been talking about with the different realities, right? Like there's you could just read the story, even the original. You could just read it, right? And there it is. There's a story. Okay, now I'm going to go and do the other thing and read the next story, right?
Yeah.
Or you can do what you've done here, which is like interpreting symbolism. Like even from the very outset, it's like, well, there's a dark forest.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's a very easy thing to even look at your life right now, for those that are watching and listening, and be like, well, is there a dark forest in my life?
Right.
What is that doing in my body? And a lot of people will be able to relate to that. And I really love the message there in this particular one, rather than the meta, the specific one of like kissing the slimy thing and hoping it will become something, as opposed to, it almost sounds like she becomes sovereign herself before she can meet somebody else that's sovereign.
Right.
Yeah, which is a much more powerful message.
That's an amazing message to give out in a story. And we got to remember that these stories were passed down generation, going back, perhaps definitely hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, these stories have been just working their way around in oral traditions, and largely told by mothers to children. You know, it's actually, it's interesting that the Grimm brothers are the ones that put them together, but it feels to me like a more of a female tradition of the sharing of these stories, although not strictly. But it's like, you know, old wives' tales, this kind of idea. It's like, you know, you're telling the children a story to go to sleep, or you're telling them a story, but you're actually informing them of, like, this is the life that you're going out towards. We're going to put it in this form, but when you get to see a frog in real life, you'll know what to do, because I've told you what to do. I didn't have to say, you know, nowadays we would have to sit down and have the birds and the bees discussion, and, you know, funnily enough, as much of a metaphor as that is, but we'd have to have a very literal, like, hey, this and that, and trying to track every single situation.
Exactly.
But in the story form, you mull over it, like I've spent the last, say, I first heard that story broken down 9 years ago. And in the back of my mind, I go round through the story again and again and again and again, and it teaches me from the inside. So then something in my behavior will naturally shift out of this story that is percolating in the background.
It's perhaps a blatant breaking down, but the way you're saying it's almost like give a man a fish or teach him how to fish. In a way, because like you could tell your daughter or son or whatever, hey, when a guy does this and acts in this way, then don't do that. And when he does this, but there's infinite permeable options of frogs.
Right.
Right?
And the actual life doesn't happen in such a linear way.
Never.
It's like, hey, what? This guy bought me a drink. Does that mean I have to sleep with him? Yes. And then you remember back, wait a second, is that some kind of contract going on? Oh, I don't have to. No, I don't have to be true to that contract. The princess wasn't.
Yeah, you get the bigger kind of the meta understanding of the situation. You know? It's a little like, I was listening to Michaela Boheim recently, and she was describing about your body's knowing of situations. And she says the question, like, how many of you have realized the relationship you're in wasn't the right relationship even when you started? You know? And like, there's so many people that be like, oh yeah, I know. Yeah. But it's very easy in that relationship, oh, but he does this and she does that, and this is good and this is why it works, without that kind of deeper layer of like stepping back and being like, well, is this a frog? You know, is this that? Yeah. There's a bigger thing to track onto.
And I like your example here, because it's what I like in this story. It's not about males and females or anything like that. For a guy, you can also see like, wait, what am I kissing the frog here? You know, what is my, or alternatively, am I being the frog? Which is another deep question, right? But it's kind of like, what am I up to here? I'm not into this.
Have you heard, this is so interesting, have you heard the term frog farmer?
No,
this is an Alison Armstrong term.
Oh, really?
She's one of my favorite relationship coaches.
Yeah, you talk about her.
And she says there's so many women that want to find a frog to become into a prince, but actually what happens a lot of the time is women already have princes and turns them into frogs. So she calls them frog farmers. Interesting little tie over there. So it's definitely not gender specific.
Yeah, indeed.
So, well, then let me ask you a question on this then. Like, I can imagine a lot of people just by hearing this, again, it's just the nature of, it's almost a parallel to talking about cranial and being on the table, to talking about myth and then actually speaking a myth. Because I'm sure people just from that story would be able to relate it to a deeper layer of experience. How can people go about, that are interested, go about diving into this world? Because I know for me, if I just picked up another fairy tale, I wouldn't be able to break it down the way that you broke it down. So where's the starting point for people that want to look at the underlying of reality through myth and story?
I mean, I don't know if it's the starting point, but my mind immediately went to Jung. He's barely a starting point, though. He's very hard to decipher, a lot of his stuff. But I mean, he wrote a book later in his life called Man and His Symbols, which is, I believe, more accessible, and it's not just him that wrote it. There's other analysts, including Marie-Louise von France, writes in that one, and a few other Jungians are in that. And Man and His Symbols really goes into that lens. And there's another book that I have by my my couch and I read it over the course of several years, and I'm probably about 30% of the way in.
Awesome.
And it's called it's one of his collected works, volume 9, which is the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And I think that's, if we kind of edge towards, like, that's what we're kind of trying to talk about, and Jung would talk about that the psyche is made up of archetypes, and these archetypes aren't personal in the way that, yeah, there's a personal unconscious too, but there's also a collective unconscious which already has all of these symbols. So when I'm talking about, say, the princess, that's an archetype, and we all know what that archetype is. Even if you've never heard of princess, almost, like you would get, like, somewhere in your system, you're, oh yeah, I know that. Or if you didn't know exactly what that is, I'd tell you, you know, it's the daughter of the king and queen and she lives in the palace. You'd be like, oh, okay, gotcha. So there's a sense of, like, that plugs into the archetypal way of thinking. And one of the things about archetype is that they're not infinite, but they're also, there's many of them. So you'll see sort of stuff out there of, like, the 5 archetypes of this and the 12 archetypes of this. It's like, okay, yeah, it'd be nice if it was as clean as that, because then we could just, like, roll it out and everybody could understand archetypes quite easily. But they just don't work that way. They just refuse it. It's kind of like earlier in our conversation we talk about participation in the mystery. That's what these archetypes are like. And just like you said there, like, I could just read that story and then go and do something else, or you could participate in that story and start living it. So I guess my answer would be, like, for starters, I'd really recommend going back to the old stories. There's many good versions of the Grimm brothers that you can get for basically for free if you have a Kindle, because it's all out of copyright, of course. You know, usually they just put in these illustrations so they can sell it for a few bucks. But all of these stories are there, beautiful translations, some of them with quite nice illustrations, and then seeing which stories grab you, and which stories you're like, that doesn't mean anything to me. But some of them, it's like, oh, I want to spend some time with these stories, and I'll often just find a new story where, wow, that's speaking to something. That's speaking to something really deep. So going to the stories, I'm big on the Greeks. I'm big on going back to the Greek mythology, because those stories have just, I just feel them so to be so rich and textured and talking about.
Did you feel that
so
way
many
before
things.
your experience in Greece, or is it since then?
Well, that's funny, because I since then, the Greece that I went to when I was in my early 20s, I had no idea about any of this stuff, which is crazy, right? Because I'm going to some of the temples and I'm going and seeing the ruins and things, and I'm like, oh, that's pretty, or something, you know, that's interesting. If I went now, it would just be a whole nother set of layers that I would be seeing there. Again, the same conversation, right? When I go there in my early 20s, I'm like, yeah, this is cool. If I went there now, I would be much more excited about the whole thing on that level. I was excited to be somewhere other than Perth, Western Australia, the most isolated capital city in the world, but to be there and fully experience them. But so access points to this stuff is a tricky one to talk on. I mean, Jung really was something that I participate in, that I get into what he's writing about, what he's talking about, and the more of that I pick up, the more he sort of says, hey, you're allowed. He almost comes through the pages and says to me, you know what, you're allowed to think that the way you think, you're allowed to do that. And in fact, the split between Freud and Jung is a really interesting moment in psychology. Psyche means soul. Ology is, you know, logos of the study of soul. And yet, it's not the study of soul. It's not really. But Jung tried to make it the study of soul. And there's a lot of post-Jungians. James Hillman, we had in our book club, The Soul's Code, and these kinds of books help you to spend time with it. But there's a lot of blocks to the Western psyche of even going there. Yeah. And I get that, and I want to sort of honor that. I understand why. You know, I understand that these stories got demonized. You know, this is all pagan stuff. A lot of what I've said today probably is blasphemy already, before I've even got into speaking on religion. You know, because I'm talking about a polytheistic tradition, which means multiple gods. And these days we talk about binary, we're left with a choice between monotheism or atheism a lot of the time for a lot of people. And then I'd see that there's, like, if you could drop out of that, you could get back to multiple gods. You could see how, say, Hermes, the messenger god, is working through your life, or Zeus, the one on the mountaintop, or Hades, the one in the underworld, or Poseidon, the one in the ocean, the one that's ruling over the ocean. We know what that means.
Yeah, totally.
We know what realms they're talking about.
It's like feather brick truck again, but with much more kind of applicability if you open the door to it, right?
If you open the door to it, yeah.
You know, you remind me a little bit of a friend, a really fascinating woman that next time she's over here, I should get you two together. Reverend Jo, she's a reverend of the Agape Church in California.
Okay.
And she's self-taught Aramaic in the 80s through microfiche at a library. That's where she started.
Wow. Okay.
Read the Bible front to back, has a very different interpretation. Even of one of the Garden of Eden is interesting. It's not a tree of good and evil, it's ripe and unripe fruit. And the way that she just turns that in a totally different way, because she's reading direct from source, not from the King James, but from the closest thing we have to the thing in the original language. She's also a medicine woman through, I think it's Cherokee is her lineage. She has Cherokee blood, and her grandmother that was part of it, and she's done some very, very deep, amazing spiritual journeys with Native Americans to get to where she is. So she's a medicine woman there, and she's this reverend of a non-denominational church.
I love that.
And she speaks Aramaic, and
she
said something similar about the Western mind, that this stuff can't be approached. And she was even talking about the Bible.
Yeah.
She's like, the Western mind can't really understand the stories the way that they are in the book.
Yeah.
They can't really, especially with Native American, but even with the Yahweh traditions through Judaism, just doesn't really map onto. So it's almost like you can't put it aside totally, but there has to be some opening up and allowing into that space to even talk about a God that's 2,000 years old from Greece, 6,000 years old from Greece. But I'd love, maybe an example from you would help of the way that you either think or use the gods as an archetype in your life.
Yeah, well, I mean, in so many ways, actually. In so many ways. For starters, like, if I can go back to that piece around monotheism, theism and atheism, I think the way we look at these things, the way we look out into the world is the way we eventually see ourselves. You can't separate those two out. So if I see one God, then I see one self. If I see no God, I may see no self. And if I see polygod, many gods, I see many selves.
It's interesting.
And I start to relate to, and this is where astrology starts to sort of slip into the conversation a little bit here, because astrology shows you multiple selves, all in a communication with each other. See, now the Western mind might be like, is this guy talking about multiple personality disorder or something? It's like, no, I'm talking about multiple personalities in order with each other. There's an order to it, and that's why, back to the things I've been studying over the last couple of years, we were taught about the meta-communicator that can hold all of those parts. So you can go up to the meta-communicator, almost like, I guess, in the more Christian tradition, it would be the guardian angel or the higher self, or in the old Greeks it would be the daimon, or in the Roman it would be the genius, who stands above and sees all of the selves. So, but you can't operate in the world as that, really. You could go into a cave and explore that and never talk to anybody and just be in your higher self. But then once you're with people, you're in your 3D world. Here you are, right? And they're reflecting back to you this part that they see, and here you go. So I'm a big proponent for, like, get in there, be amongst it, be multiple. And people that know me well know that I'm multiple, because they are too. Like, all of us are. It's not, we all understand what it's like to be hanging out with your mum, or hanging out with your best friend, or hanging out with your grandma, or hanging out with people you haven't met before.
Totally.
Those are different selves that are coming to the fore, like different ways that we're trying to feel. What are we trying to do when we're in those situations? Feel comfortable, safe. And then maybe when we do feel safe and comfortable, we can let a bigger part of ourselves out and just, like, play with that part. So I guess one of the gods that I work with a lot would be Hermes. And they say that that Jesus kind of picked up some of the Hermes stuff. So, so that Hermes was, one of the things Hillman says is like, it's very dangerous to take an archetype out of its surroundings, because the archetype only exists because he's talking to all the other archetypes. So Hermes is kept in check because he has to deal, on his first day of his life, he has to deal with Apollo, because on his first day of his life he steals Apollo's cattle and sacrifices one of them to the 12 gods, including himself. This is the audacity of the archetype of Hermes, right? It's in his very first day of being alive, and he's already gone and stolen Apollo's cattle, who's his big brother and one of the great gods of the pantheon, and he's already stealing his cattle, right? And what happened in that story is Hermes was Apollo comes into the house and says, what's going on here with this kid? And his mum, I think it's Maya or maybe Hera, I can't remember, I guess it's Hera, it's like, I don't know, and Hermes is a 1 day old baby, is like, what are you talking about? I'm just a baby. All I care about is mother's milk and the comfort of this crib here. Why would I do anything like steal your cattle? What are cattle? What do you mean? What is this new word that I've just found? Kind of thing. And Apollo's just appalled by that, grabs him by his feet, takes him up to Zeus, god of all the gods, holds him there and says like, can you just check your son here? Like, he's just stolen my cattle and sacrificed one of them. And then in front of Zeus, like the knower of all things, the big truth god and all this kind of stuff, Hermes again is like, what is this guy talking about? Now he knows that Zeus has seen it, but he's still sort of like, he's got that trickster energy that is like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Is it kind of like with the trickster, would it be Loki?
It'd be Loki, but like Loki is I need to be careful here, because I want to wander into the Nordic traditions. I don't know it so well, but my sense of Loki is a little bit more dark.
He's a little bit more dark.
Whereas
more like Hanuman,
right?
Perhaps, because Hanuman's
like
very cheeky
maybe.
and friendly, and actually very loyal and beautiful as
Right.
well, but cheeky.
And so what happens there is that Zeus is so entertained by this. He's like, this is just fantastic theatre. And so he says, I'm going to put you in charge of communication of human beings and make you this messenger god. And he gives him his helmet and his staff and his wing sandals, the whole lot, and he makes sure Apollo and Hermes make up, and so he gives him the world's first lyre that he just made. Hermes has just made that out of a tortoise shell that he just kind of created on his first day of being alive. We've got, just in that one reflection, we've got Hermes and his relationship to Apollo and his relationship to Zeus, and how if we then put ourselves in that, it's like, oh, I see that one in me. I see the one that feels like, how dare you, in me, the Apollo. I see the one that kind of sees this a bit more clearly, and I see the trickster. And if I can be loving towards all those parts in a way, opening and to say, yeah, I have those parts and I'm cool with it, then they don't need to come out as shadowy ways. So I don't need to lie and steal and cheat, because I've owned my liar and stealer and cheater. And that's very hard for the Western mind, because the Western mind is used to more like puritanical, religious, strict kind of like, do this, don't do this, 10 Commandments style stuff. But we're complex in our way of taking things on. So when we're told 10 Commandments, it's like, well, I'm definitely doing some of those. So something very natural in the psyche goes, well, I'm doing it. Right? Like, you can't tell a human being, you tell them what to do, and there's something inside. Totally. One of the parts of the psyche will be like, no.
Some people it's a little bit further forward than others.
Yeah.
There's a story behind that, but I'll leave it. It reminds me of two things. One is the Walt Whitman quote, do I contradict myself? Of course I do. I am huge, I contain multitudes,
Right, indeed.
And it's so true, and I think that's such an important lesson. The two parts of that you mentioned. One is the fact that they exist, undoubtedly, that we have multiple aspects of who we are, and the second one is the acceptance of it. And it reminds me of Brene Brown, who says something like, you can't selectively numb emotions. If you curtail your anger, then you curtail your happiness.
It's beautiful.
And I think it's similar with the psyche. It's like, as much as I try to push this thing down, it's gonna come back up. It's like holding a beach ball underwater, but it won't come up as a as its more wholesome version, it can come up sideways and through.
And Jung talked about the guards have become our symptoms, our body symptoms. So that's one of the things of like working. This is where my worlds of the things I've been studying for some time now are starting to weave together, because the body work ends up being the same work, the same archetypal work. And this is something I'm really kind of like stalking on the edges of my consciousness, because I see it as this is the vision. And I know that people work like this, and you know, I'm not alone in this, but it's like very tricky to be able to be like, right, so that, you know, say you tear your ACL in your right knee. It's like, no, that was just a skiing accident. It's like, okay. But then there could be a deeper level to that.
Totally.
There could be like accidents. How do accidents happen? And what God is, and this is in the more Indian Vedic tradition, it would just be like, okay, which God do you need to pray to? Who do you need to sacrifice to? What do you need to do? So, like a friend of mine puts the example of if it's Saturn that you need to work on, then you know you feed 10 crows on a Saturday, something like that, for the next 10 weeks, something like that, right? Like, because you're trying to appease that God. And in the Western psyche, we're like, no, but I'm not working with the gods like that anymore. So it's like, cool, okay, but we're still working with the archetypal reality.
Totally, they still exist.
You know, so then we might think, well, what is Saturn? It's about boundaries. It's about structures and boundaries and limits. Do I need to do some healing around structures and boundaries and limits, right? Then we can, and then funnily enough, my example is that knee, right? So the thing that holds structures and right. So that's how we sort of stalk these things. We don't demand that it tell us.
It's the same as the fairy tale.
It's the same as a fairy tale.
Is it just the knee, or is it not just the knee? Like,
right.
And like, I just met, and we're running and coming up on time in a moment, but I just, from my own experience with you, my main takeaways from doing Astro with you, and I may not get all the signs right, so you had to remind me, but my main takeaways were let the lion play, feed the fishes, and placate the virgins. And these were 3 archetypes in my system. Like, one of the issues that I was going to you with is that I feel so incredibly comfortable and empowered in the front of a group of however many. I could be 50, it could be 100. I've done 1,000. I feel like I could be in front of 50,000. I'll be totally fine. But afterwards, I don't want to talk to anyone. I'm not really good at making small talk. I feel very awkward if we're just sitting around in a cafe and it's like, like that really doesn't work. And I carried a lot of guilt around that, like teaching a class or a training and then just genuinely not being able to specifically straight afterwards have a conversation and it felt like I was showing up as a different person. You know? And I'm like, why can't I just be one person? Which one is fake? The one that's in the front of the room or the one that's here? And then the archetypes, something around Leo, which is center stage, in the spotlight, and Pisces, which is more of a moon sign, which is
your moon sign,
which is my moon sign, and more reflective and backspace. And in my particular chart they were diametrically opposed, but both of them. So it's like, I gotta let the lion play, but I also gotta feed the fishes. And then the virgins come in another way, but that's probably enough to get the point for now, where it's like, well, there was an unsaid, unformalized idea in my mind of guilt around these 2 things. There was no framework to put it on. It was amorphous, unable to be touched. And then speaking to you using the chart, it's a little bit like feather brick truck, but more complex and deeper. And through conversation and insights of yours, it's like, oh, well, yeah, of course there's a part of me that loves to be in the front of the room. But if I don't have that, then it feels totally empty. And that I need both, you know? And it's like something in me can then go, yeah. And you know, I remember the moment of working with this, and it's like, I have these dichotomies in my psyche. If I don't have that framework, then I may think of myself on some level. One of these parts is going to think the other part is fake in some way, or an enemy, or broken, or like, you know, whatever stories we might put around that. And then, but we get, through astrology, we get the meta perspective and say, oh wow, this and this. Oh, fantastic. And you knew anyway. Like, I'm never telling people new things. I'm just like saying, hey, you know how you're this? You're also this.
And that's like, whoa, am I loud?
Yeah.
I thought I just had to choose one. It's like, no, you don't have to choose one. You're many and multiple and varied, and actually the more you allow for many, multiple and varied, the more full your life is going to be, and the more like this is where the paradox comes in. The more consistent you'll be, oddly enough.
Yes.
Because you're not forcing parts of your psyche down into the shadowy realms where they're just going to come up as shadowy behaviors, or they're going to come up as body symptoms, or they're going to come up as like sabotage, even mental health symptoms can come out of that, of like, you know, when you're really pushing your psyche around like that, psyche revolts.
Totally. Maybe that's a good place to wrap it up, because I can imagine a lot of people that would be listening to that and sitting with that and being like, yeah, there's that. I think everyone can have the sense of there's something wrong with me, and there's something broken, and there's parts of me that I don't want to be seen, there's parts of me that I don't even know that I don't know. And I guess the great message is something like, yeah, we are many, we are multitudes, and all of them are welcome. And then if you want to take that a step further, then it really helps to have a guide. And there's a quote from an astrologer actually that I like, which is, I'm a guide, I'm a trusted guide to your own intuition. Which feels kind of nice, right?
Yeah,
it's like,
I get down with that. That's true.
And that's what I think with you. It's like your ability is to actually talk and dive in with people and pull out these different parts of their psyche and ask questions to allow their own knowing to come up to surface. And this isn't just from my experience. We've got dozens of friends that have had treatments with you and students. So I really appreciate the work that you do, and the bravery it takes to tread between both worlds and stay true to what you find.
Thank you, James.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
And if people want to get in on some of this biodynamic magic, even while they're in isolation, I believe it's possible, hey?
Yeah, I'm doing Zoom sessions, particularly with the astrological psychotherapy that I'm doing. So yeah, it's easy to book a session, and there's plenty of time and space with people right now, as we are all in sort of some form of lockdown.
And a massive necessity too. I think with people being alone, being either by themselves or with people in quarantine, there's a lot of chance for those shadow sides to come up, let's just put it that way. And things like loneliness and separateness.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, then let's finish with a question I ask each person that comes along. And that is, if you could put a sign above every yogashala, or perhaps it's every therapy room for you, what would that sign say?
If I could put a sign above my own...
Everyone's. On the planet.
Everyone's, like, yoga
or therapy room, I think, would be more apt. And you're like there's a sign, they walk in, it just sits up top. You can say a few words.
Well, I would probably quote the old alchemist Hermes Trismegistus, I think his name is. Trismegistus, can't remember. But it is the full quote, which is, as above, so below, as within, so without, as with the universe, so with the soul.
Dig it. As above, so below, as within,
so without, as with the universe, so with the soul.
I've never heard the full version of that before.
I like it in its fullness.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for watching. It's appreciated. Any questions or comment, you can just put them in, and I'll include some links so you can get in touch with Chris if you want, or in touch with me. Just check the text box or whatever it's called. Have an awesome day wherever you are. I hope you're safe and healthy, and catch you next time.